Okay, good morning. It's Rick Foster. I'm going to talk to you today about insect management in high tunnels. And there's been a lot of interest in the last 5 or so years in high tunnels in Indiana and most of the other Midwestern states. And the reason primarily is because of season extension. You know, if you're a vegetable grower in Indiana growing in the field, and let's say you plant your vegetables in May, early May, for many vegetables you won't start selling anything until at least June and probably closer to July. And then by October, it's getting cold and you may have a frost and things aren't going too well other than pumpkins and those sorts of things. And so really you're looking at July, August, September, and October as being the only months when you're making money. And so the idea of being able to extend the season either early or late is a real advantage, because if you can just add a month to the beginning and a month to the end, you've increased the period of time when you're actually bringing in money by 50%. So that can be a really big deal for a vegetable grower. And then sometimes the prices are higher very early in the season or very late in the season when people who are only growing outside aren't able to produce. And so there are some advantages there. So we have a lot of interest in season extension. And there are a number of different season extension techniques. Obviously, growing transplants saves time, using plastic mulch, row covers, low tunnels, and the more expensive ones would be greenhouses and high tunnels. And today we're going to focus on high tunnels. Now, these have been around for quite a while. The first one who used them was Dr. Emmert down in Kentucky, and he called them hoop houses or cold frames. And really a high tunnel is nothing more than some sort of a frame with plastic stretched over it. And there's no supplemental heat, and we call them high tunnels because they're tall enough to work inside, as opposed to low tunnels, which I guess you crawl on your hands and knees to work in those. So that's a pretty simple definition of what a high tunnel is. Now, there are some problems with high tunnels. One is that if your high tunnel is a permanent structure or semi-permanent structure, you're growing in the same soil and over again. And so you can get soil fatigue. So you may have to plant cover crops and things like that in there in the wintertime to build up the soil. You can also get some soil-borne diseases building up in there. One of the things that we discovered the first year that we used our high tunnels was the wide temperature fluctuations. And you can see the chart on this slide that shows the daily highs and lows, where the highs are approaching 100 degrees and the lows are down in the 40s or even in the 30s. And shortly after we planted our first planting of tomatoes, we had a day when the temperature, or a night when the temperature got down to 28 degrees, and we covered our crops with 2 layers of row cover, and inside the high tunnel with 2 layers of row cover, we still got to 32 degrees, and we had a fair amount of damage to our plants that were planted anywhere other than in the ground. We were planting in buckets or in kind of a hydroponics type of situation, and those plants were severely damaged because they weren't getting the radiant heat from the ground. And so we bought ourselves about 4 degrees or so of protection with the plastic from the high tunnel and 2 layers of row cover. So it wasn't a whole lot of protection. But the interesting thing, as often is the case early in the spring when you have a very cold night, it's a clear it's clear. There's no clouds in the sky. So later in the day, when the sun started beaming through the high tunnel, the temperature went from 32 degrees to about 110 degrees in just a matter of a couple of hours. And so temperature regulation is a very important part of managing a high tunnel. And they're fairly expensive, certainly a lot more expensive than putting things in the field. And in our case, we bought high tunnels that were about 28 feet by 48 feet, and those cost a little over $3,000 just for the structure, not including the things that we had to add to it. So it's a fairly expensive proposition. But there are some real advantages. You have the opportunity to add 3 to 5 weeks to each end of the season, and depending on what crops you choose to grow, things like lettuces or those kind of greens, you can grow those practically year-round. And then, of course, the timing benefits that I talked about earlier. You can also get increased yield because you don't have problems of wind and variable rainfall and all those sort of things. Yields can be increased. I've heard raspberry growers talk about just these bumper crops of raspberries that they get growing in high tunnels compared to what they get growing them outside. And then the quality can be better too. There's a lot less disease problems because of the lack of rainfall, the lack of overhead irrigation. There's no wind blowing them around and those sorts of things, so quality can be improved. And then another potential area is in pest management. I already mentioned reduced plant diseases. We're using weed mats, and that suppresses weed competition, so that's an advantage. And our thought when we started the project was that we would deter insects by growing them in the high tunnels. When we looked at the literature, we saw that most popular literature was talking about how insects would be a lot less in high tunnels than they would be in the field. And so we tried to come up with some hypotheses on why this might be the case. One thing would be exclusion by the walls, but because it gets so hot in those high tunnels, you have to roll up the sides, particularly on sunny days, and so there's a lot of opportunity for insects to move in and out. So that might not be a factor. We thought maybe the light passing through the plastic might diffuse it and cause the insects to have a problem orienting to the sun during flight. And then we also thought that maybe the microclimate in the high tunnel might be less favorable for the pests or more favorable for natural enemies. And most of the literature says that aphid mites and whiteflies, which are typical greenhouse pests, would also be most problematic in high tunnels, and so those are the ones we were expecting. And a couple years before we built our high tunnels, I visited a farm where they were growing high tunnels, and these were some peppers that were grown in the high tunnels, and you can see they're just covered with aphids, lots of honeydew, just a mess. They were dripping with honeydew. And right outside the high tunnel, the farmer had planted peppers outside, and I could not find a single aphid on those peppers. So I knew that things like aphids could be a real potential problem in the high tunnels. And so why are these particular pests more common in high tunnels or greenhouses? Probably the uniform climatic conditions, the lack of natural enemies, and probably most importantly, the lack of rainfall. These very, very tiny insects, just a drop of rain falling on a leaf will knock them off, and then they can't get back to the plant and they end up dying. So rainfall is a big mortality factor for some of these smaller insects. So our hypothesis was that insect pest densities within the high tunnels would be lower than in the field, and so we set up the study with a high tunnel with a field plot right next to it so we can make direct comparisons there. And we grew 3 different crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, which are both commonly grown in high tunnels, but we also wanted to grow something else from a different plant family, so we chose broccoli and we put that in there as well. Not too many growers are growing broccoli in high tunnels, but it was a good test crop for us to use. We used black plastic mulch and drip irrigation. We arranged the experiment in a randomized complete block design with 3 replications. A tunnel was an experimental unit, and then the controls, or the comparison, was with the field plots, which are right next to the high tunnels. For data collection, we took whole plant counts of insects. We used sticky cards to monitor flying insects. One insect that we discovered first was the tomato or tobacco hornworm, and we saw a lot of those. Here's a nice big juicy one. And this is what some of our plants look like, and you can see that the hornworms had completely stripped the tops of the plants of foliage. Okay, here's some more examples. And another example. That's kind of a nice picture, but it's not very good if you're trying to produce tomatoes. So the tomato hornworms obviously did very well within the high tunnels, and when we compared those populations to the field, we got more hornworms in the high tunnels than we did in the field plots, and so this was kind of the opposite of what we expected, and it was fairly consistent throughout the length of the study. One good bit of news from this was that we had a higher percentage of parasitism on the hornworms in the high tunnel than we did in the field. So at least the natural enemies were also getting into the high tunnels. Then on our broccoli crop, we had 3 main caterpillar insect pests, the same ones we would see outside: imported cabbage worm, diamondback moth, and cabbage looper. We didn't see any differences between inside and outside with the imported cabbage worm, but we had significantly more cabbage loopers and diamondback moths, and all caterpillars combined inside the high tunnels than we did outside the high tunnels. So again, the popular theory that high tunnel crops have fewer insect problems than ones grown in the field was shown to be untrue. And here's one of our broccoli plants. You can see it's pretty much completely defoliated, and you know, that head of broccoli is pretty ugly and obviously would not be marketable. Okay, so some of the high tunnel pests that we encountered were the ones that we expected. We saw mites, aphids, and whiteflies. But we also saw hornworms, yellow-striped armyworms, imported cabbage worms, cabbage loopers, diamondback moths, caterpillars, zebra caterpillars, and cucumber beetles. And they all seem to do pretty well. Now here's some pictures from our high tunnels from this past summer. This is some cucumbers that are severely attacked by aphids. You can see how limp those leaves are, and the shiny surface from the honeydew that's dripping from those aphids. And later on, this is what the leaves like. They just died because of the amount of aphid feeding on them. So extremely severe aphid problems on cucumbers in the high tunnels. And then we also saw a pest that really was kind of new to me. I've heard about it and read about it for sure, but never really experienced it, and that was russet mites on tomatoes. And here you can see the discoloration on the leaf. Here you can see holding a damaged leaf with next to a healthy leaf, and you can kind of get an idea of the difference between the two. And here's what the russet mites look like. They're very, very tiny. Most of you are familiar with two-spotted spider mites, and those are very tiny. You can barely see them with the naked eye. And two-spotted spider mites are many times larger than russet mites, so they're extremely tiny. And here's another picture that kind of gives you a better feel for just how tiny they are. You can see the hairs on the tomato leaf and how the russet mites compare in size to those. And they occur in very, very large numbers, and it takes a lot to cause a problem, but there were gazillions out there. It was amazing, and they really stunted the growth of the tomatoes, and we had to take some control actions to keep the plants alive. Okay, here's another one, and we saw it in our high tunnels, but I got dozens of reports from people around the state of Indiana with yellow-striped armyworms on their tomatoes in their high tunnels, and you can see it's easily identifiable because of that very bright yellow stripe down each side of the caterpillar, and you can see a little bit of the damage on the tip of the leaf on the upper left there as well. But more importantly, they will feed on the fruit, and you can see a ripe tomato fruit that this one is really chowing down on. So these yellow-striped armyworms can be a really severe problem in high tunnels. So the conclusions that we've come to are that insect densities in high tunnels are as high or higher than in field-grown vegetables, and so we're going to have to manage them. The idea of all you're going to have is aphids and mites and whiteflies, and if you take care of those, everything's going to be great, is just incorrect. And so growers are going to have to deal with hornworms and all the other problems that they have in high tunnels. And we would prefer that they use a variety of techniques that we call integrated pest management, and those would fall into the categories of cultural, biological, and chemical control. So control options, cultural control options, come in several different forms. One, and probably the easiest for things like hornworms, is hand picking, and that's pretty labor intensive, but you do have a relatively small acreage within that high tunnel, so it is possible, particularly when the plants are fairly small, to just walk through there and find the hornworms, pick them off, and destroy them. Now I say here other forms of removal. There are some other techniques that can be used. Some thing that we call devacs in entomology. They're just basically a vacuum cleaner type thing that sucks the insects off of the plants that could be used, but probably the better use of hand picking or removal would be something big like hornworms. Sticky traps can be used for flying insects, and they catch a fair number, but these are better used as a monitoring tool than as a control method. They will obviously catch some, but usually not enough to do as good a job as you would like for management. And then another possibility is using small mesh screens on the sides and ends and any other openings, and basically trying to exclude the pest insects from getting in. And of course, as you're going in and out of the tunnels, they still have the opportunity to come in when the doors are open and that sort of thing, but putting these mesh screens can help to eliminate a lot of the ability of the insects to get inside. There is, though, a temperature effect. We have an experiment going right now in our high tunnels or this summer, where we're using the mesh screens as one of the treatments. And when you walk into that that tunnel, it's noticeably hotter than in the other tunnels where the sides are open. Even though it's just a screen, it's not solid, it really does limit the movement of air, and so it does heat up quite a bit more. And preliminary data indicated that during most of the summer, we're talking about 10 degrees warmer in the high tunnels with the screens than in the other high tunnels. And of course, as you know, insects' growth and development is all driven by temperature. So the hotter the temperatures, the faster the insects are going to develop. So particularly for things with a very short generation time like aphids and mites, you can turn over generations very, very quickly with that elevated temperature, and that's one of the reasons why we see these really, really high populations of aphids and mites developing where the temperatures are higher there. The other thing about the screens is that it also keeps out natural enemies. So if a few of the pests get in, the chances of their natural enemies getting in to control them is relatively small, and so that could also be an issue with the small mesh screens. Biological control is something we always like to look at, and in a lot of greenhouse production, particularly in Northern Europe, they do all their pest management with biological control there, and the reason is that they have complete control over the environment. They control the temperature, they control the humidity, they control what moves in and what moves out. And so the idea is that in those situations you can release natural enemies, and you know, in the field or in a high tunnel where you got the sides up, if you release natural enemies, they have the opportunity to just fly away, and of course that doesn't do you any good. But those small mesh screens provide the opportunity that if you release natural enemies within the high tunnel, they can't get out, and so you may be able to get better biological control in a scenario like that. Now, the project that we have going on with Ian Kaplan, myself, and Laura Ingwell, who is the postdoc who's actually doing all the work, and at Hort Congress, she's going to be discussing the results of this study, which I think many of you will find very interesting, and I'll talk more about that Hort Congress event in a few minutes. Now, that leaves us with pesticides, and there are a lot of issues involving pesticides in high tunnels. And first of all, states vary in how they regulate pesticide use in high tunnels. In Indiana, a high tunnel is considered a greenhouse. Now, that's not true in every state, but in Indiana, if it's a high tunnel, it's just like a greenhouse in terms of what pesticides you can use. So a pesticide label may prohibit its use in a greenhouse, and if that's the case, it cannot be used in a high tunnel. Now, other pesticide labels specifically list greenhouse use, and if that's true, then you can use that in a high tunnel. But the majority of the pesticide labels, and particularly the older ones, don't mention greenhouses. And so the state chemist's office has ruled that if there's no mention of greenhouses or no prohibition from using it in greenhouses, then it can be used. So the idea is that if it's not excluded, then it's okay. All right. So in terms of determining which pesticides you can use, if it says you can, you can. If it says you can't, you can't. If it doesn't say, you can. Okay. So look at it that way. Now, in the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide, we have a section that we put in a few years ago related to greenhouse and high tunnel pesticide use. And here are some insecticides that can be used in high tunnels. And the first column are the ones where the label specifically says that you can use them. And the second column are the pesticides that the label just doesn't say anything, and so it's okay to use them in the high tunnels. Okay, and then this is the list of ones where the label specifically says that you cannot use these products in high tunnels. Okay. Now, personally, I have some real concerns about the use of pesticides in high tunnels, and this is the reason why. The re-entry intervals and the pre-harvest intervals for most of these pesticides were determined for crops that are grown outdoors. And you know, when I think about pesticides, the majority of pesticides are broken down by heat, by sunlight, and washed off the plants by rainfall. And so when we put plants in high tunnels and we treat them with the pesticide, the sunlight is different. Now, how different in terms of pesticide degradation, we really don't know. But the sunlight is different. It's diffused, so there is a possibility that the pesticides will not break down as quickly. And probably more importantly, there's no rainfall, so the rain will not be a factor in washing those pesticide residues off the plants. And so, to me, there's a real possibility that these pesticides may not degrade as rapidly in high tunnels as they do outdoors. And when I think about growers that I've seen who are working in high tunnels, they pack those plants in as closely as they can, because they're really looking at about $10 worth of production per square foot before they make money in a high tunnel. So they really have to have a lot of plants close together and have a lot of production. And when those plants are very close together, when you're working in there, you're brushing against those plants all the time. Okay, and growers have to be in those tunnels every day, just about, in order to do the work that they have to do. And so they have a lot of intimate contact with those crops. And to me, there's the potential for increased exposure to pesticide residues in those high tunnel situations. Now, I've spoken with the EPA about this issue, and the bottom line is they have no idea. They have never done any studies to determine whether there's increased exposure, and don't appear to be too interested in addressing the issue. So my approach then is to tell growers, if you're going to use pesticides in the high tunnels, choose the ones with the lowest mammalian toxicity, so it will be safe for you, your family, or your workers, just in case the residues are higher inside than they would be outside. Okay, let me talk for just a few minutes about some future trainings that we have planned. On Thursday, January 22nd, at the Hort Congress down in Indianapolis, we are going to have an all-day high tunnel workshop, and the topics include all aspects of high tunnel production. So we're going to have a full-day program covering everything. We're going to spend about half that day talking about pest management, and some of the topics that are going to be addressed at that workshop include Dan Eagle's been doing some work on the impact of plant spacing on disease development in high tunnels. The idea being that if you have plants too close together, it doesn't give the plants the opportunity to dry properly. You don't get as much air movement through those, and so you may have more disease problems. And he's looking at it also from the point of view of letting how many plants do you have to have, or close together the tomato plants have to be to optimize yield as well. So so he'll be talking about some of that work. And Laura Ingwell, as I mentioned before, who's the postdoc who's doing the work on biocontrol in high tunnels, will be presenting some of her results, and then I'll be talking in a more general way about insect management on high tunnels as well. So I just want to remind you that Extension educators can attend the Indiana Horticultural Congress for free. Their registration fees are waived, and we would love to have you you attend that workshop if you're interested in high tunnels. And finally, I want to talk about a training that we're going to have in the entomology department here on campus on February 15th, and that's the wrong date. It should be 2015, I'm sorry. We're going to do a day-long training for educators in entomology. And we're going to cover all aspects of applied entomology, including field crops, fruits and vegetables, landscape and turf, household pests, and beekeeping. And if there are other topics that you would like to see addressed, let me know, and we'll find somebody to talk about those things. And if you're interested in attending, contact either me or Tim Gibb. Tim is the one who's going to be kind of coordinating this activity. And I've talked to Mike Schutz, and he said that you as educators should either use your staff development funds, or if you've expended those already, contact Mike, and he'll come up with the money to get you here and get you home safely. So I just encourage anybody who has a special interest in entomology to come to that training. So again, that's on February 5th, 2015, not 14. So, okay. And with that, I think we're done. So I think that's it. Okay, we have a question from Kathleen. Can we send this link out to the general public on the webinar? Seems like some of the information may not. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. This can go out to the general public. There's nothing special in here at all. Obviously, they're not going to come to the training in the entomology department, but the rest of it, it's fine. Yeah. Just use it whenever you can. And if you want to use these slides for any kind of a presentation, you're welcome to do it. Doesn't bother us at all. So. Okay, thanks.